Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Now more than ever, independent media needs the support of listeners and viewers. You can visit the website aroundtheempire.com to find out all the platforms where you can find this show, to find out how to support the podcast and gain access to the bonus content. And I'd just like to note that there's both an audio and a video version of the show. Our guest today is Hrvoje Morić, host of the Geopolitics and Empire podcast. About a week after the protests and unrest in Kazakhstan in early January, Hrvoje and I got together for a chat about the questions we still had about the situation, about our skepticism with the immediate claims of color revolution. Some things have changed in the past 2 weeks since we recorded this, but for me, many of the same questions still remain. Hrvoje Morić is a podcaster and an educator. He lived in Kazakhstan from 2017 to 2020 while he worked as a teacher at the Nazarbayev Intellectual Schools. He's also a professor of international relations. He served with the Peace Corps in Mongolia, and he has traveled extensively. We recorded this on January 13th, 2022. Welcome to Around the Empire. We have a special guest today, Hrvoje Morić, the host of the great Geopolitics and Empire podcast and video show, which is, I think everybody who listens to this show and watches it is going to like his as well. So it's great to see you again, Hrvoje. How you doing?
I'm doing good, and it's always great to chat with Around the Empire. I love the work that you do as well, and we share a lot of guests.
Yeah, we do have some of the same guests, which is, some really good guests. But I think we both do have. And it always amazes me that people are willing to give their time and share their time and their knowledge. And thank God for that, because I wouldn't have a show otherwise. So tonight we're going to talk about Kazakhstan and what's going on in there. And of course, there's a lot of news and analysis floating around about that. And I haven't really said anything about it publicly because I just have a sense there's a lot of what I think might be knee-jerk analysis that's just not sitting right with me. And I don't have any issue criticizing the United States, American policy, NATO policy, the empire, or anything like that. So it's not a matter of just not wanting to believe that, we just went in and did another regime change, color revolution. It's just, I need to look at things more thoroughly. And one of my favorite things about you as a person and your show is like your desire to seek out many different perspectives on any crisis, any situation. I'm not qualified to make an analysis of my own on Kazakhstan. I can only go in really Central Asia as well, but I do know a lot about regime change operations. I've observed lots of those things. I observed a lot of world leaders, media, how they react, and I take a lot of my cues from those kinds of things. Let me look at my notes here because I wanted to mention a couple things. But the almost immediate declaration that this is another U.S. color revolution, this is another regime change, it does seem like a knee-jerk reaction to me. I totally get why people would think that, right? It totally could be. But I also this is sort of anecdotal, but I also, one of my kids tended to get in trouble all the time, right? And other kids figure out pretty quickly that if you did something wrong, what you do is you blame it on that other kid who's always gets in trouble, and it works a lot of the time. So I do have that affecting me too. But so it goes without saying that it very well could be another regime change operation. But the world's changing, and there are a lot of other things going on. There are other significantly powerful actors out there. And so to be fair, one of the reasons why I would have no trouble believing that this was another color revolution is that I've been waiting to see what was going to happen with the Beijing Olympics because I followed the Maidan very closely. I remember, what happened during the Sochi Olympics, and with the upcoming Olympics in Beijing, with all the hostilities toward China now, I've been thinking, would they do that again? Would they really do that again? And I'm sure that Russia's been on the watch for it, right? That was a very embarrassing situation for them. And, Beijing, of course, any country is going to be worried about the security and things like that before hosting the Olympics. But I would think that given the situation, I would think they would be particularly anxious, protecting against that kind of thing. But there's also there's the issue of the Russian embarrassment over the Maidan. And the fact that Kazakhstan is the keystone, I think, if I'm not incorrect, the keystone of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? They've got oil and gas. They've got, I think you mentioned, they have a huge amount of uranium and other
monopoly, 40%. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a crazy amount, right? So, but there's other things like when we withdrew from Afghanistan, when it became clear that we really were going to do it. I don't know if you had to have noticed this. The British completely freaked out. Complete freak out. Like I've never seen them freak out like this before. So there's that. Also, the CIA, for some weeks or months before the withdrawal from Afghanistan, they were griping about, we're going to lose our bases. And then there was all kinds of sort of maybe sensational, maybe not, reporting in the New York Times and other places saying these other Central Asian countries are not going to, let us establish some bases in that area. We're going to be blind from an intelligence standpoint. And it was reported, and I don't have any trouble believing this, that, the Russians exercised some influence on the Central Asian countries to make sure that our Western intelligence didn't just move their operations into the stand countries. Well, I had a couple more things, and you brought up some great things, which I have some more things to ask you about in your recent interviews, and I'll link those in the show notes. Hrvoje has a solo episode and then an interview so I'll link those for the audience. They're a must-see, I think. But the best part of all of this, and I'm glad that you agreed to do this interview this time. Last time we did Swapcast. Today he's an interview subject. You actually lived in Kazakhstan, which I had known before this, and recently, right? Did you live there recently?
Yeah, from 2017 to 2020. Yeah. So it's been about a year and a half since I left. Yeah.
So, I mean, you're one of the first people I thought of when I thought I really would like to hear your thoughts on it. And not just this situation, like what was it like to live there? And what are you thinking about the current crisis right now?
Yes. Yeah, well, technically, I was employed by Nursultan Nazarbayev, and Tokayev was honorary dean at my alma mater, Geneva School of Diplomacy. So, I've got a little bit of that kind of experience. But I would just add what you were saying about the knee-jerk response, that even though I've lived there and I've studied color revolutions and all of these things, it's really not that clear to me what's going on. And there are a lot of people who have who are really good at, analyzing color revolutions or analyzing populist protest movements. And, they see what's happening, and the first day they just jump the gun without really evaluating the evidence. And as you said, I have no problems, saying, oh, it was the Kazakh government's fault, right? And the people were protesting against the Kazakh government. And let's be honest, that happens history is full of episodes where the people revolted against the government. And I also have no problem saying it's a US, European Union, Turkey, NATO color revolution, regime change, either. Yeah. But it's or it could be a mix. And that's kind of this week, I'm just trying to figure out what's been going on. And my vision is also a bit colored because what I was obsessed with in graduate school and what I wrote my master's thesis on was color revolution. And when I was in Kazakhstan, I was telling people that Kazakhstan was ripe for a color revolution. And I saw the color revolution infrastructure in Kazakhstan. I came across local NGOs that were funded by Soros, USAID, NED, and they were working with the students that I was working with. Wow. So they were there. And I recall maybe once or twice where I would take a walk in the Central Park where I lived in Semey, and they got this big plaza. And once I remember seeing, and it was a Saturday, and there were policemen, security, internal security, policemen, military. They were all over the park, like on the outskirts. And I knew one of them, and we talked, and I'm like, "What's going on?" And he's like, "Well, we're expecting potential unrest, like for protesters, people to come to the plaza and protest because of Abyazov, right? The corrupt banker who's in France. He might send out through the social media WhatsApp telling people to start protesting all over Kazakhstan, and people would go and protest, and nothing happened on that Saturday. Nothing happened, but they were there, kind of prepared. And this kind of tells me that the Kazakh government does fear unrest from its own people, right? So this is not like the color revolution. People will say, "Oh, the Kazakh people, they love their government, and it's just America coming in." And it's like, no, wait a minute. There is real. The Kazakh government sees, the potential of its own people to go against it, right? I saw that Saturday. So that there's that real organic factor of people going against the government, which you also need for a color revolution. But again, at the same time, there is that color revolution framework in there. We've got the whole Soros operation operating within Kazakhstan. And another thing that I said when I first came to Kazakhstan was I had been reading Russian articles of Russian military analysts saying that, and I also believe this as well. We know that the US, EU, Turkey, Israel, NATO, they finance ISIS and Al Qaeda, right? That old story. They're the mercenaries of the West. They're more like mercenaries. Some of them are not even that hardcore into Islam. They're just in it for the money. And I'm sure there are these extremist Islamists, Salafists, but that they would send them then to Central Asia. And this was kind of known long ago. And so what did we see just, in a few, we saw these reports of there being hundreds or thousands of these types of violent possible Islamists. So it's like, if we were expecting this years ago, and it's just happened now, then that does add evidence to this theory of the external, but at the same time, you might need organic local discontent. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, one or the other. It could be elements of real people being unhappy. And then that's what you need to kind of start the second part of the process. And this didn't look like a typical color revolution, as people pointed out. There was no leader, there's no symbol, there's no color, it was
no
disordered.
Plaza. I don't think, was there any big plaza or, meeting place?
No, I mean, it didn't come together like a typical color revolution. And so it's like maybe, and kind of what you were saying before, this is probably like the worst effort at a color revolution I've ever seen from the West. And it was just knocked off in a day. So what's going on here that would lend less credibility to it being a color revolution, or just saying that, the West has just lost its mojo. The empire is just completely waning, and the Russians and Chinese are just getting much more powerful. So, I mean, that's kind of my take. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not even exactly sure why I was so skeptical, because I can easily believe these things. But I guess one of the things was the Russian and the Chinese reaction to it. Also, the fact that, oh my God, I just forgot his name. The guy who's been the leader in Afghanistan, or for Kazakhstan for 30 years.
Nazarbayev. Yeah.
Nazarbayev, right. Nobody has seen him, right? So there were rumors that he fled the country and his whole family, right? Has it? I haven't checked that in the last day or two. Has there been any further information about that?
Well, the researcher I interviewed today, we heard reports that supposedly Nazarbayev is still in the capital, Nur Sultan, and that basically his conclusion was that the Nazarbayev clan is, the status quo is continuing, so that the Nazarbayev group was still remaining in charge. So I don't think that they may not have fled.
That's even weirder.
This is what I'm saying. There's a lot of anomalies. And then the other thing that I heard saw the reports, and the guy told me in my latest podcast interview that that the Kazakh security forces, with all this unrest, I guess in the capital or in Almaty, that like they didn't cordon off, I guess, an area that they should have, and they kind of let like violent, some of these more violent people in. And that's, again, that's why I mentioned at the end of my solo podcast, I mean, it could be a false flag, and I've had people tell me, I've had a friend of mine who also, he's not Kazakh, and we worked together in Kazakhstan. He's telling me that, a very smart guy, and he doesn't think that Tokayev would, or Nazarbayev, do something like that. But I'm always skeptical. I believe it's in the capacity of any state actor to do something like a false flag. So,
I'm just remembering now, one of the things that made me skeptical was when I saw the casualty count. It was low, really low. There were like a lot of injuries, but was it like a dozen people who were
something
killed?
like this? Yeah.
Yeah, I just feel like it was very good for the cameras, the buildings on fire and things like that. But and I saw, I mean, there's been a lot of video clips going around, but one of them was showing a whole group of people, but they only had one gun. There was only one rifle, one AK. The beheading, is that true? Do we know? Is there pretty?
I haven't gotten more info. I asked my guest that today. He didn't answer about the beheading. But he was saying that it was like local people who got hold of the guns and they didn't really know how to operate them, he made a good point that if this was like a real US-backed jihadi operation, it would have been like urban warfare and civil. It would have been still ongoing, but that they in one day, they so quickly ended it. And again, my reference is 1999 Moscow apartment bombings. I believe the Russian state carried out that false flag, and it's funny how here, the Russians just like swooped right in, done in one day, wham bam, and end of story. And then that kind of bolsters the CS. A lot of, I don't know. It's just, I think it's really early to kind of figure out, but. On the other hand, Pepe Escobar did a really great article for The Cradle on, the angle of this being Turkey and NATO sending in the jihadis to destabilize. So this makes sense too. If it wasn't a color revolution to overthrow the regime, which it doesn't seem, at the very least, maybe what purpose was just to destabilize, like they did in Syria and Libya, just to wreck the place.
Yeah, and I don't know. Maybe I overemphasize Syria, but that is the one that I look back to as well. There were lots of legitimate reasons for the uprising. Lots of seeding of the regime change operation as well. But the official story is that the original protests were they were organic. They were regular people with legitimate gripes, and the regime cracked down on them, and that got them fired up, and then other armed groups came into it and all that. But there was over time it became clear that's not. There were armed organized groups from the start, from day one, and it actually even came out in this little documentary. Of course, I'm not going to remember the name of it. It was something like 11 Days in Aleppo or something like, or From My Window in Aleppo. I'll put it in the show notes. I'll put a little image up of this. But that guy showed that the armed groups came in immediately. They started, blocking off the streets and taking positions and things like that. So it wasn't a true story. It was a planned operation for a long time. But yeah, it was mainly to why did they, or why did we want regime change in Syria? It was to have full control over that country and to be able to do with it as we liked, whether that was, the transport of pipelines through the very, very convenient, centrally located country there. That made a lot of people say that was it. I think, in fact, that's Pepe Escobar's part of the pipeline estate.
William Engdahl and others. Yeah, the energy is key. Also, probably to help Israel expand territory geographically as well. Probably at that.
There are a lot of other but anyway, but with the false flag thing, if you have thought that through, like I have some ideas, but I really don't know how plausible they are. Like, for instance, if we stick with the Olympics theme, let's say that maybe NATO was thinking about stirring up trouble during the Beijing Olympics again. It could have been sort of to set something off ahead of time to make sure that couldn't happen. That would be a very, possibility. Like you mentioned, the CSTO coming to the rescue, is pretty good for Russia and for the various. I don't know whether there's going to be a NATO or Russian, Chinese NATO or whatever. The CSTO, you don't hear a whole lot about them, really. I don't even know if I have a fully developed theory on that one, but
this is why it would give them fuel to advance the CSTO from, as you mentioned, what it is kind of weak right now, and to just kind of bring it closer to becoming like this Eurasian kind of NATO force. And then that discussion of just who knows who's there's a lot of these crazy Russian analysts that make these extreme opinionated articles, and this talk of integrating Kazakhstan with the new Belarusian Russian union state. But I think that's their long-term plan anyways. They want a Eurasian union just like the EU. And it's not just an economic union. They want the political structures integrating, and they've started to do that with Belarus and Russia. So obviously they want to do that with Kazakhstan and some of the other countries. And if you're going to have that, you also want to have a version of NATO. Like you have EU, and then you have the EU has NATO, and they're talking about an EU army. So it's like NATO is kind of like the training wheels that maybe they would just morph it into an EU army, or just get rid of NATO and have an EU army. And I think, and that's what they want to do with the other parts of the world. So, I mean, that's one thing in the back of my mind, but it's not easy to carry out a false flag that successfully. So again, I mean, this is just one option. But it does help the current status quo of Nazarbayev and Tokayev and everyone. From what I heard, that they just shuffled around ministers, and so it's the same people that are remaining, and like they're going to tackle corruption. It's kind of like it gives them a reset in Kazakhstan. So there are benefits for them in that sense. But if you had to ask me, I'd go with Escobar's jihadi destabilization campaign. I don't think it's quite exactly a color revolution, because they didn't have anyone to replace, to lead the color revolution and replace Tokayev. So
yeah, and they're not asking for an interim government, which is usually the next step after.
Well, there were some calls for that. First, it was like energy prices, and then a few people started shouting about like a new government, but then it didn't morph into this, proper color revolution.
Yeah, I saw the list of demands that came out, but it was shady, but it was, blurry of like where it came from. So like it didn't come out, there was no like protester that got up on a stage and said, these are our demands, it just came from some news organization or something like that, if I remember right. And so, I mean, the obvious question is cui bono, right?
This is, I think, gets us closer, who's going to benefit. I think this will help us a bit more figure out, what's going on.
Now, when you lived in Kazakhstan, is it a very compliant? Are they very compliant people? Is there a lot of inequality? Is there a lot of corruption? I've heard there is. What was your sense from
I'd
the
say
population?
There is a lot of corruption. So yeah, there's a lot of corruption. In general, I don't think that, even though it's one of the better stans, it's not that great economically, and there is a lot of inequality. And what was the other point? People, what I found is that in large part, people were afraid to a lesser degree. Like they were compliant with, at least the 3 years that I were there, and all of the people that I came across, it seemed like I didn't really come across people who were like dissidents who wanted to go against the government. It felt like most people just kind of like wanted to comply. And I even some people told me, like in whispers, after I started talking about politics, some local Kazakhs, like, please, let's not talk about politics. They were afraid. So they were still, it was almost like I was still in the Soviet Union, where some Kazakhs were afraid to talk about politics. They were afraid they were being monitored, or there might be some way their conversation with me might be heard, and so they just and that was one of my point in I don't know if it was in my solo podcast or my today's podcast, that most of the people that I came across just kind of wanted to get on with life. I didn't come across people that were like ideological against the regime or the government. They just they want to have a good job, they want to have families, and they were kind of compliant, which kind of that kind of adds to the theory that it is an external provocation. But again, I was in one, and I was living in Semey, which is the town of dissidents. Everyone knows, like, the people in Semey in general are more dissident. That's where they sent all the dissidents. But maybe the people that I came across weren't like that. But I did hear from friends that, yeah, there are other Kazakhs that are, active against the government. I personally never came across these people.
Right. So I sampled some of the mainstream media stuff, and I watched this France 24 segment, and they started it out with, they said, it's a country the size of Western Europe that's aspiring to become one of the top 30 global economies by 2050. As well as its rich energy resources, Kazakhstan's political stability has helped attract foreign investment. Much of the stability and economic growth can be attributed to one man, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who ruled the country with an iron fist since the breakup of the Soviet Union until 2019, and has continued to wield power from behind the scenes. A lot of the public anger that has come to a head is directed at the 81-year-old. So at the same time, building up Kazakhstan to what it is today, they give him credit for that, and then they say that all the anger is directed at him. Does that make sense to you?
It does. One time where the mainstream isn't so wrong, because it's like, yes, of course he's corrupt. I mean, how can he not be? And like in most countries, most politicians are corrupt. There's that inequality. They took so much money. The elite, the Kazakh elites, they got billions, I guess. So yeah, it's not like, he played it straight for 30 years. It's corrupt. What do you want? It's an oligarch, plutocrat, whatever. So yeah, that's true. But at the same time, I don't know, maybe if we compare it to other countries as this corrupt oligarch or whatever, maybe he did do more for Kazakhstan than others in other countries, because at the schools where I worked, they put a lot of money into he built the Nazarbayev University, which is a high quality university. It's got a lot of international professors there, and he spent well, was it his money that he took from the Kazakh people, or I don't know, but anyways, it was the money that he had, and he's poured a lot into the Nazarbayev University. And where I worked, these 20 elite high schools, it's grades like 6 or 7 to 12, and it's free for the students that get accepted. And it's like it's a lot of money. All of the facilities that were built, the salaries, and the food for the students. And so you do see money having been spent to build up Kazakhstan by Nazarbayev. So I can see both are true.
Where would the anger come from? The current anger, at least.
Well, like I said,
what would be the main sources? Yeah.
Oh, I mean, there is the corruption. It's obvious that government officials are corrupt, and they get more economic benefit. They get away with stealing money and stuff. I mean, I don't know all of the local details. I'm just assuming in that sense that there's this corruption, and in general, it's not a great economy. So of course, people are going to be frustrated, and especially the last 2 years of the COVID stuff. It's like that the guy I talked to today said 4 million Kazakhs lost their jobs because of the pandemic situation. So
and what's the total working population there? Wasn't that half or something?
There's 18 million. The population, he told me that 8 million are working, and so that if half the workforce lost their jobs.
Yeah, I did catch that part of it. I didn't hear the whole interview, but I did catch part of it. I think didn't he say they lost their good jobs and they ended up with gigs, maybe delivering food economy, and things like that. So it kind of sounds a little familiar. End up in service jobs. Sounds like the neoliberal
neo-feudalism. That's what it is for all of us. Yeah.
And if that's what's happening there, yeah, I mean, there are so many things to consider in this. And then I guess the last thing is that part of the reason why I guess I'm skeptical about some of these things is that, sometimes I think it's not a nation state versus nation state kind of thing going on. So there's that.
That's what I pointed out in one of the articles. I can't remember his name, the former Indian diplomat. I mean, it's a difficult name to pronounce and remember.
I know who you mean. Yeah.
And he was pointing
out MK.
Yeah. Something not MK Ultra, but MK. But he was pointing out that again, it's just a lot of strange stuff. Like you would assume, okay, Kazakhstan was the Russians and Chinese, but then why are there so many U.S. bio labs in Kazakhstan? And of course, they wouldn't be let in if Nazarbayev wasn't buddies with the Pentagon and all of that. And he was pointing out that U.S. intelligence has long penetrated the Nazarbayev, group. So it's like Nazarbayev and Kazakhstan are tight with the West in one area or one sense, and then in another they're with the Russians. So this again goes back to the globalism idea. It's that globalist where we've got these international elites. You've got the backroom corporate deals and all of this stuff, and it comes down to money. I think I'm not a communist by any means. I'm anti-communist, but transnational capital, it's like money speaks the loudest, I guess. So.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you might want to say before we wrap up?
In terms of Kazakhstan, might say, let's see. Well, again, I think one of the most important points is what we started with, that not jump to conclusions, right? Because a lot of people that do is they might be passionate or they might want to get clicks, right? Because you're the first one to comment and then you get a lot of clicks, and I'm not into that. And anyways, I think I have a more academic approach as well. And the more academic thing to do is like, wait a bit, let's sift through what's going on. You can't just jump into stuff. Give it a few days, right? It's like let it mature a bit, and then you might get new info that pops up. And so I'd also say Kazakhstan is a great country, so we shouldn't let different events color our perception of the country. And even before all of this, I still did kind of in some ways admire Tokayev and in some ways Nazarbayev. And there were a number of Kazakhs that I came across that were proud of, even though with all the complaints of the elites, they looked up in some ways to Nazarbayev or Tokayev because of the past history and of having brought Kazakhstan forward. So again, it's not that, and it gives them that sense of that homeland, the ethnic pride, and all of that. So I think we need to have a lot more nuance. This kind of tribalism that we have is not always so good.
Yeah, because it's more important to sort of understand or have good information than it is to take a side, right? Yeah. All right. So I think we'll just do a really broad bonus question in which I will say, if your back's against the wall, what's your best guess on what actually happened?
Yeah, that's
I know, it's really tough.
That's a tough one.
I know.
But as I said before, my vision is colored with my color revolution background, studying that. And given the fact, like you have the scientific method, right? You have scientific method, your hypothesis, and if it's proven true, you get the conclusion, and you have your theory. And if your hypothesis isn't proven, you don't have a theory. If my hypothesis had been for so many years that this would occur, and it occurred, then that kind of makes me think that my hypothesis was true. And that hypothesis is that it was an external influenced event. And then when you go into those details, it's like, was it color revolution apparatus, or this sending the, Salafist jihadis in? And from what we've seen with these, there were reports of these violent people coming in. And so it's like, and you already mentioned that there's just so much interest for the West to meddle with Kazakhstan. And so,
tons of motive there.
And if you follow the trend, it's just logical as well, just following the trend along the map. If they're messing with Libya and then Syria and then Iran and, Mackinder, they're just trying to get into Eurasia. It's just logical that, they'd mess with Kazakhstan. So, if you had to boil it down, it would have been the external regime change operation, but it was just so pathetic. I don't know, like what?
Yeah. Plus, maybe I'm putting too much focus on like meddling with the Beijing Olympics, but they have that long border with Xinjiang, right? They have that long border with China. Even if they just wanted to rattle them a little bit, because they already decided, what did we decide? If we're not, I guess we're sending the athletes, but we're not sending whatever we're doing to protest the Beijing Olympics. So there's that. And I guess, they probably worried that China is going to further improve their image in the world with another spectacular Olympic display and facilities and all that. So I think they would have liked to knock them down a peg. I don't know how much cooperation they were getting from the current leadership of Kazakhstan, so it's hard for me to make a judgment on that. But one thing we didn't talk about is Turkey and Erdogan. He's got a lot of problems right now. He's got political problems. He's got financial problems. Is it possible? And then he jumped right in after it happened. It's like, I'll help. I don't even know exactly what his plan was there, but is it possible that Erdogan did this on his own, tried to launch his own little, I don't know, just a thought.
I think that he has this idea of a neo-Ottoman expansion, and Kazakhstan and Turkey are supposed to be, ethnically, culturally, like one, brothers. And we've seen the Turkish, incursions with Azerbaijan, what happened there in recent months. And so again, that pattern of if you went if Turkey was messing around there, then why wouldn't they expand and mess around in Kazakhstan? I don't think he'd do it.
It would have had to go rogue, right?
Probably, he'd have to probably have okay from NATO or some of the Western partners. But as I mentioned, if we saw these violent extremists come in, I think that would have been Turkey backing that. That would be the assistance, because it's the Turks, that have the connection with the radicals, like the ones that went into Syria and stuff. And so, I wouldn't doubt Turkish involvement at all. And that's what Escobar also, I think, covers.
The gray wolves and things like that. I did hear things about that from the beginning. I had one other point, but now I can't remember what that item was. Let me just look for it real quick. I may have it in my notes. The foreign investment. Do you know of any move to there's Western oil companies there, right? And as you mentioned, there's Pentagon, there's definitely Defense Department type operations that were allowed to happen there. And there's the issue of China is just about to make some, maybe they already have, but they're about to invest a really significant amount in establishing some sort of main backbones for the Belt and Road Initiative. Anybody who's going to make a big investment wants some guarantee of security, right? So what do you think about that factor? Was there dissatisfaction with the government, a lack of trust? That they didn't really move anybody around. So that's the odd thing. That makes it look more like a failed color revolution. But they took out the one, so they basically fingered one minister, right? The guy who
head of the KNB, the intelligence.
But he's not in charge of the police, right?
Oh, it's the CIA, the FBI of Kazakhstan. I mean,
okay, but isn't there a separate ministry who covers the actual security?
I don't know exactly, but I mean, what you mentioned about China, an anecdote that supposedly in Nur-Sultan, Astana, they were going to build this train, from the airport all the way in to the city, like an above ground tram metro type deal. And it was supposed to be the Chinese who were going to build it. And it's just been like, they completed a portion and it's just been sitting there for years. So it was like, I don't know what, something went wrong, like corruption or bad quality or something. And that just that's not a good sign if we're talking about Belt and Road and Chinese coming in. And this thing is just for years laying unfinished. It's just like, yeah. So
is it possible that, so we're not seeing anything get shuffled around in the official leadership, but if there's a fairly well-structured corruption leadership, if you will, authorities, is there any sign that any of the big mob bosses were taken down, or one took over from another, or anything like that?
As of now, it just doesn't seem like it. It seems like the status quo in terms of internally Kazakhstan just continues. That there doesn't seem to be much change.
Yeah.
Internally.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. I guess if I really had to be, I don't have a better theory right now other than the color revolution, but I'm not 100% sold on it yet. So I guess we'll see. All right. Well, let's wrap it up then. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Always love talking with you. Please tell everybody where to find you. Maybe you want to talk about your sort of restructuring of your show and things like that.
Yeah, the website would just be geopoliticsandempire.com. Although now it's after like 5 or 6 years, I'm remaking it completely to something much better. And you might just see a maintenance in work in progress if you go there, but in a few weeks it should be live and It's going to have a lot of new stuff, but otherwise you can find me on all mainstream and alternative media.
All right. Great to talk with you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, same here.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Hrvoje Morić. Follow him on Twitter at Geopolitics_EMP. Find his podcast at geopoliticsandempire.com. This is a fully independent podcast. In this age of censorship, your support is more important than ever. Go to the website aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can get access to the bonus content and support the show. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and leave reviews. They help. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. Join us on Telegram, t.me/aroundtheempire. And we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody. Stay strong.